היועץ המשפטי לממשלה ממליץ על הגשת 3 כתבי אישום שונים.
This is wow. Netanyahu faces 1 count of bribery and 2 counts of fraud.
The multiple acts of corruption. Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to be indicted on corruption.
מגדל הקלפים הזה יקרוס לגמרי אחרי הרבה.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories that we're covering this week. The case against Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli media outlets the Prime Minister is accused of trying to bring under his control. After 5 years, the Egyptian photojournalist Shawkan is no longer behind bars. Many of his colleagues still are. Colonial residue. Governments in sub-Saharan Africa are still using laws that colonists left behind to silence journalists. And a music video comes out of China in defense of a mobile phone company. We begin in Israel and a corruption case that centers on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's attempts to control the media. A story that also exposes the degree to which certain Israeli news outlets are willing to sell out their coverage. Elections are just weeks away, and Netanyahu is looking at charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. One of the cases alleges the Prime Minister agreed to limit the distribution of one newspaper, Israel Hayom, in exchange for positive coverage in another, Yediot Aeronot. He's also accused of offering a telecoms company, Bezek, lucrative government contracts, buying, in effect, positive news coverage on a website owned by the same company, a news site called Walla. The Attorney General handling the case says Netanyahu even had a hand in choosing which editors and reporters Walla would hire or fire. Prime Minister Netanyahu is using the fake news defense, calling the case a witch hunt cooked up by political rivals and their friends in the media. It's a line he's used before, but the victim narrative is starting to sound a little unconvincing. Our starting point this week is Tel Aviv.
מי האדם הראשון בהיסטוריה שמאשימים אותו בשוחד על סיקור חיובי? אותי.
באמת יש כאן משהו אירוני, או אפשר להגיד אפילו טרגי.
בנימין נתניהו. האדם הכי מושמץ בתולדות התקשורת הישראלית.
התקשורת בסופו של דבר היא זו שמפילה אותו.
שידורים מיוחדים, חגיגות באולפנים.
ולא בגלל שהיא חשפה שחיתויות שלו.
כי מה קורה עכשיו בתקשורת?
אלא בגלל שהשחיתות שלו היא הניסיון להשתלט על התקשורת.
המסקנה היא שסיקור חיובי זה שוחד, רק אם קוראים לך נתניהו.
זה באמת סגירת מעגל מושלמת.
This is a first in Israeli political history. A sitting prime minister faces indictment on multiple counts of corruption and media manipulation. The telecom and media baron getting contracts and bribes from Benjamin Netanyahu in return for favorable coverage, Shaul Elovitch, the man who issued the indictment notice, Attorney General Huawei Mandelblit. In his written ruling detailing the grounds for indictment, Mandelblit walks us through an extensive system set up by Netanyahu to control media coverage of himself, his government, and his family. It's damning. However, supporters of the Prime Minister argue he was left with little choice.
All
the cases have to do with the media. Why was Netanyahu so involved in the media? Why did he try to meddle so much with it? Nobody's asking that question. Could it be that Netanyahu is vilified by the media more than any other prime minister in the Western world? There's no prime minister or president anywhere that's so savagely criticized. Day in, day out.
Well, it's poetic justice, isn't it? The thing that was most important to him finally brings him down, you know. He's blaming the whole world. Everybody now is a lefty. Everybody now is out to get him. The media, the Attorney General. Well, Mr. Netanyahu, if you're watching, I'm not out to get you. I'm just really, really sorry that this happened.
The Prime Minister's contentions that he is up against some kind of left-wing media conspiracy fail the scrutiny test.
במסע הציד הזה, נגדי, לא בחלו בשום אמצעי.
The Attorney General leading the investigation, Avichai Mandelblit, was appointed by Netanyahu himself. Two of the prosecution's key witnesses, reported to have provided the most incriminating evidence, are former confidants of the Prime Minister. and details of what is being called Case 4000, involving Israel's biggest telecom company, Bezek, which owns the online news site Walla, paint a picture of elaborate media manipulation. Police allege the Prime Minister's relationship with Bezek's CEO, Shaul Elovich, was based on bribes. Netanyahu provided Bezek with government contracts and regulatory favors in return for not just flattering coverage of his government, but a hand in the way the website operated. Police say that from 2012 to 2017, the Prime Minister or his staff blatantly intervened hundreds of times and on a near daily basis, often calling Elovich in the middle of the night to demand changes in the coverage.
There are recordings in which Netanyahu speaks with Elovich, who then passes messages on to Elan Yeshua, the CEO of Walla. So it's obvious that Netanyahu tried to intervene. We spoke with Walla's journalists, asking them how come there were positive articles on Netanyahu as well as negative ones. Were you for or against him? They explained that what we were seeing was the tip of the iceberg. Underneath, there was a constant battle about whether to follow the orders that came from Netanyahu or for the editorial team to just do its job.
Looking at Walla workers, at Walla reporters and Walla junior editors, I think that some of them were maybe too young and they couldn't see the big picture, but it was not only on their shoulders. It was a matter of their chief executive editor and the director of the company. Those were the people that did it.
The Netanyahu-Elovich relationship resulted in politically driven material like this video. It first appeared on the Prime Minister's website on the morning of March 17, 2015, the day Israelis voted in the last general election. Within minutes, it was on Walla's homepage, where it would remain, on the orders, say prosecutors, of the Prime Minister's office.
That video, the Arabs are flocking to the polls, which is just pure incitement, was on the homepage for a whole day. It was disgusting, totally unjournalistic and rather immoral. Then there were dozens of articles and photos of Sarah Netanyahu helping Holocaust survivors, for instance. Now, it's one thing to post such pieces which really have zero news value, but to then take down other articles, such as the piece on the poverty report in Israel, actual information that is important, that was a disproportionate favor. Did I know things were as complex and detailed as the indictment shows? No, I had absolutely no idea. I didn't know that they were actually helping choose images for specific articles. I didn't know that Sarah Netanyahu herself was sending text messages. If we would have known about it, Walla would not have had any reporters left.
Case 4000 and the communications between Netanyahu and Elovich is just one of the corruption allegations under investigation. There's also Case 2000, backed up by secretly recorded conversations in which Netanyahu offers to support legislation that would limit the distribution of the country's most widely read newspaper, Israel Hayom, a free tabloid, in return for favorable coverage in the biggest traditional paper on the market, Yediot Aeronot. The prosecutor's announcement of a coming indictment happened just weeks before an election in which the Netanyahu campaign clearly has the media in its sights. Posters have sprung up featuring journalists' faces and bearing the slogan, "They will not decide this election." Netanyahu's team has also launched a Facebook broadcast to, quote, throw the fake out. In the increasingly polarized Israeli media space, there are still voices the Prime Minister wants to hear, avowed allies. Some of whom can be found at news outlets like Channel 20.
I don't get it. When the leftists criticize and attack Netanyahu, it's considered journalistic integrity. But when a right-wing journalist says he supports the Prime Minister and thinks he's doing a great job, then suddenly I get attacked for my journalistic integrity? Have you ever asked a left-wing journalist about their integrity? You never have. Why do you only ask me? There should be one standard for all the media.
One standard. סטנדרט אחד לכולם.
לגבי השאלה ששאלת, האם בעצם כתב החשדות...
As for whether this indictment can play in Netanyahu's favor, the answer is absolutely yes. Part of his genius is that he realized how to use this. They often say that after each Netanyahu scandal, his party gets an extra 2 seats in the elections. This time, we're right in the midst of an election, and the indictment helps Netanyahu push the idea that the leftist media, the patronizing media, is trying to dethrone him. Netanyahu has turned the media into the biggest demon, and this indictment, in my opinion, is only making his campaign stronger.
In previous elections, Netanyahu built an enemy in the shape of Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Today, the situation isn't one that enables him to build an enemy from the outside, and therefore he's building up the media and the justice system to be the enemy, saying, "They're trying to bring me down."
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Flo Phillips. Flo, the Egyptian photojournalist Mahmoud Abu Zayed, better known as Shao Khan, released from prison this past week after something like 5.5 years behind bars. But he's not exactly a free man, is he?
No, not exactly, Richard. Undeniably, this is one of the best pieces of media news to come out of Egypt lately. But one condition of Shao Khan's release is that he spends every night for the next 5 years at a police station. And all this for a case that so many consider a sham. Shao Khan was arrested back in August 2013 during the early days of the Sisi government. There was a huge pro-Muslim Brotherhood demonstration in Cairo in which at least 600 protesters were killed. Shao Khan says he was just taking pictures, but he wound up behind bars charged with murder and terrorism. It took more than 5 years for the case to get to trial, and by the time he was sentenced, Shao Khan had virtually served out his time. Here's what he had to say when he got home.
إحساسي بعد ما خرجت أكيد طبعاً سعيد يعني طاير لأن أنا مش أول صحفي يعني يتحبس يعني أو صحفي يموت ولا أنا الآخر.
There are still more than 30 other journalists in Egyptian prisons, including Al Jazeera's own Mahmoud Hussein, who's been in jail now for more than 2 years. Hussein still hasn't been charged with a crime, let alone convicted.
Okay, now to Croatia, where hundreds of journalists took to the streets of the capital, Zagreb, just last weekend to protest against pressures that are facing the media. What kind of things are they talking about?
So they've got a variety of complaints, Richard. They say they're often abused and threatened, and that the government meddles in the country's media. But what really stands out here is the sheer number of lawsuits being filed against Croatian journalists. More than 1,000 are currently being sued for myriad reasons under a law the Croatian Journalists Association says is being abused. The way this law is written makes content deemed shaming or humiliating a criminal offence. And it's pretty easy to see how powerful people could just use that to their advantage.
And while most of these lawsuits are being filed by politicians, what's with these news outlets that are suing some of their own employees?
So this is the bizarre part. Croatia's public broadcaster, HRT, is suing 36 journalists, including some of their own. 6 months ago, HRT fired Huawei China. He's also the head of the Journalists Association, after he spoke out against political interference and censorship at the station. He's been at HRT for 21 years, and now the channel is suing him for $70,000. The European Federation of Journalists issued a statement urging Prime Minister Andrej Plenković to get to work and to take concrete steps to limit abusive prosecutions against journalists.
Okay, thanks, Flo. Next, we're moving to a media story whose roots date back to the late 19th century. European powers were setting sail for Africa, sweeping across the continent, colonizing country after country. And once they took power, they wrote laws designed to ensure that the colonized would not rise up against the colonizers. Laws that could also be used to silence, censor, jail, or intimidate journalists who refused to toe the line. Come the late 1950s, Africans began revolting, and over the next decade or two, most countries would win their independence. However, much of the colonial legislation remained in place. And there is now a growing list of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa falling afoul of those laws that were never written with democratic societies in mind. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on the colonial-era laws that still determine what can and cannot be reported in sub-Saharan Africa.
October 2018 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, newspaper editor Sylvanie Kiaku was jailed for publishing articles critical of a bank. She was prosecuted under a defamation law dating back to 1940, when the DRC was a Belgian colony. November 2016, 5 Zambian radio journalists were arrested for allegedly calling a member of the ruling party a useless person. They were charged under Section 179 of the Zambian Penal Code, which dates back to British colonial times. And in another former British colony, Botswana, Utsa Mokone, a newspaper editor at the Sunday Standard, published a report that the former president was involved in a late-night car crash. He was charged with sedition.
I told my lawyer that, you know what, I am going to plead guilty to sedition, because I believe I did the right thing. And if it's deemed seditious, so be it. But there was a change of government, and the new government decided to drop the charges against me. But I was very disappointed that they withdrew the charges, because that took away the only opportunity we had to challenge the constitutionality of the sedition laws.
So, sedition, compared to a lesser offense of defamation, which we're much more used to, is very specific to who can allege sedition. It is people at the pinnacle of power in any society. The assumption is that the said comments, remarks, views expressed have a potential of causing a national security threat or a public order threat.
One suspects that because the newspaper was so independent and had been writing about other matters that was clearly upsetting the government of the day, that they used that as an excuse to move against the journalists. The irony, of course, is that the world looks at Botswana and sees it as a bastion of democracy and stable rule in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet, unfortunately, sedition still remains a crime in Botswana, and it is used to close down the democratic space.
Which is by design. Colonial-era laws weren't written to protect democracy, but to limit dissent. When countries like Britain, France, and Belgium established their African colonies in the late 19th century, the new colonial administrations expected journalists, who were almost exclusively white and mostly compliant, to highlight the achievements of government, perpetuating the notion of African dependence on colonial rule. They also wanted would-be opponents silenced, and a legal framework was created to that end. But when the decolonization process began in the late 1950s and African governments started coming into power, securing independence was the priority, not media freedom. And the new leaders saw value in the laws that they inherited.
What happened after independence? When our black leaders took over, before they were calling for a free media. But after that, they changed. They decided to use the strategy that was used by their colonial masters. And there was a reason for that.
Why? Because the nation building project, the forcing of people to now identify themselves as, let's say, Zambians, Botswana, now have to be centrally managed or centrally controlled. So in order to do that, the new governments found it necessary to send a single message as the only voice that had their good intentions, and everybody else was destroying what this government was trying to build.
Our leaders see the media as an opposition, and they don't understand the role of the media, because the older generation of our leaders were hiding behind this idea of nation building and cohesion.
We contacted multiple governments in countries that still have colonial-era laws in place to ask why, decades after independence, those laws are still on the books. None of them got back to us. It's not just the legacy of colonialism that lingers on in Africa, but the legal residue of apartheid in South Africa. Next month marks 25 years of democracy in the country, but journalists there still have to contend with laws that were designed to preserve white minority rule. The 1982 Protection of Information Act gave South Africa's apartheid government sweeping powers to keep secrets and silence journalists. In the democratic era, many of the provisions in that law are deemed unconstitutional, but that hasn't prevented its use.
A big surprise was last year when an investigative journalist called Jacques Poe, who had written a book called The President's Keepers, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of a police raid.
At the moment there's police officers.
Ostensibly because he had confidential information from the intelligence services in his possession. He's been charged under this act. And while the case hasn't moved ahead against him, it's still hanging over his head.
The ruling African National Congress has made several attempts to replace the 1982 Protection of State Information Act. Its version, the Protection of State Information Bill, even made it through Parliament. But campaigners, journalists and lawyers said it was new only in name and still gave the state unconstitutional powers. The bill remains unfinished business. It's been on the president's desk for nearly 6 years now, awaiting signature. Until then, the apartheid-era law remains in force. Historic laws aside, there's an unwritten cultural code in the region. It's called Ubuntu, the idea in African culture that a shared sense of humanity builds and binds communities. The challenge for modern-day African societies and their leaders, who are no longer united by the common goal of ending colonial rule, is how to reconcile the reverence of Ubuntu with the irreverence of critical journalism.
Not too long ago in this very same Botswana, criticizing a public figure, especially political leadership, could be seen to be a lack of Ubuntu. But the attitudes are changing as people begin to identify themselves often as taxpayers and as citizens, where then their concerns these days are less about journalists lacking Ubuntu and more about the media or journalists not digging deep enough.
It's important that people realize that if they want to live in a democratic society, that there is no way that a government, a democratically elected government or a post-colonial government should be in a position to use colonial-era laws or apartheid laws to try and subjugate the population.
I am convinced that they want to keep those laws in the statute books because they have a vested interest. And there is no way these guys are going to voluntarily relinquish their power to the extent that journalists are able to criticize them freely.
And finally, the legal cases around the Chinese mobile phone manufacturer, Huawei, and the U.S. Justice Department are crawling through the courts. The charges include stealing trade secrets and doing business with the likes of Iran, North Korea, and Syria, all countries under economic sanctions. Now, a private Chinese company has released a propaganda video of children singing the praises of Huawei. And who better to produce the lyrics than a former member of the People's Liberation Army's song and dance troupe? As Mao put it, the only way to win a revolutionary war is by mobilizing the masses. Now, the Chinese masses are being mobilized online to come to the defense of a mobile phone company. Only the bulk of the social media chatter on this has been mockery, since Huawei has consistently tried to distance itself from the Chinese state. We'll leave you now with a snippet of Huawei the Beautiful, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
停下手机，谁